Did you enjoy the lake house I gave you, Mom? Ethan asked, his voice light, almost casual, as if he were asking about the weather instead of something that made Margaret Whitmore's fingers freeze around the edge of her plate. For a moment, she thought she had misheard him, that perhaps grief or age had begun to distort simple words. But the room was too quiet for that. The kind of silence that settles after polite laughter fades and before something unspoken begins to surface. Margaret lifted her eyes slowly, her pale blue gaze moving from her son to the woman seated beside him, Clara, who was smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her linen napkin with a precision that felt deliberate. "What house?" Margaret said, her voice steady, softer than expected, not confrontational, just confused. Ethan blinked, the easy smile faltering at the edges as if a script had suddenly gone missing. "The lake house," he repeated, slower this time, searching her face for recognition that never came. "I transferred it to your name 2 years ago. Remember? For your birthday." The words hung there, heavy and misplaced, like furniture in the wrong room. Margaret did not respond immediately. Instead, she set her fork down with care, aligning it perfectly beside her plate, a habit formed over decades of keeping order in a life that had always depended on quiet discipline. 2 years ago, she thought. 2 years of winter coats worn one season too long, of cutting pills in half to make them last, of telling herself that Ethan was busy, that success came with distance, that love simply looked different now. She had never received a house, never received anything beyond occasional phone calls and brief visits scheduled between his meetings and Clara's travel plans. "I don't think so," Margaret said finally, not accusing, not defensive, just stating what she knew to be true. Across the table, Clara let out a small laugh, the kind that tried to dissolve tension before it could take shape. "Maybe it was delayed," she said, her tone light but just a fraction too quick. "You know how paperwork can be, especially with properties like that." Margaret turned her head slightly toward her, studying her in a way she hadn't before. Not as a daughter-in-law she had welcomed into the family, but as someone whose words needed to be weighed. Clara's smile remained in place, polished and practiced, but her eyes flickered, just for a second, toward Ethan, as if measuring how much had already been said. Margaret noticed that flicker, and something inside her, something long quiet and patient, began to shift. She didn't press further, didn't ask the questions forming quietly beneath the surface. Instead, she nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement that seemed to close the conversation rather than open it. But inside, nothing felt closed. The room resumed its gentle rhythm, dishes clinking softly, Ethan clearing his throat and moving on to another topic, something about a new project, a trip out west, plans that didn't include her but were presented as if they might someday. Margaret listened, or at least appeared to, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture unchanged, composed, yet her mind was elsewhere, moving carefully through memories that now felt different under this new light. Letters that had never arrived, conversations that had ended too quickly, moments where Clara had stepped in to handle things before Margaret even knew there was something to handle. She did not feel anger. Not yet. Not the kind that erupts or demands. What she felt was quieter, colder, a realization unfolding piece by piece, like a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving. And as the evening carried on, with its polite smiles and familiar routines, Margaret Whitmore sat at that table and understood, with a clarity that settled deeper than any shock, that something important had been taken from her long before this dinner, and that whatever it was, it had not been lost by accident. Margaret did not mention the conversation the next morning, not when she woke before sunrise as she always did, not when she stood in her small kitchen with the early light filtering through the thin curtains, not even when she measured out her coffee carefully, leveling the grounds with the back of a spoon as if precision could steady the quiet unease that had settled in her chest. The house around her felt the same as it had the day before, modest and worn but familiar, every creak in the floorboards known to her, every cabinet handle slightly loose in the way she had learned to accommodate without complaint. She moved through her routine with the same calm rhythm she had kept for years, yet something had shifted beneath it, subtle but undeniable, like a note slightly out of tune in a song she had long memorized. 2 years ago, he had said, and the words repeated themselves now with a quiet persistence that refused to fade. Margaret opened the drawer where she kept her bills, neatly stacked and secured with a rubber band, and she flipped through them one by one. Electric, water, property tax. Each envelope marked with careful handwriting and paid on time, always on time, even when it meant choosing which expense could wait until next month. If there had been another property, another responsibility, another account, she would have known. She had always known, because she had been the one who kept track of everything when her husband was alive, and after he was gone, no one else had stepped in to take that role. She paused with one envelope in her hand, staring at the return address without really seeing it, and a memory surfaced, quiet and almost forgettable at the time. Clara standing beside Ethan during a visit, casually mentioning that she would handle some paperwork for him because he was too busy. Her tone light, helpful, almost affectionate. Margaret had nodded back then, grateful even, believing it was kindness, believing it was care. Now, the memory felt different. Not wrong exactly, but incomplete. As if she had only been allowed to see part of something that had already been decided without her. She set the envelope down and closed the drawer, her movements unhurried, deliberate, as if rushing might break whatever clarity was beginning to form. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, the sound fading as quickly as it came, leaving the same stillness behind. Margaret walked to the window and looked out at the narrow yard. The grass trimmed short, the fence slightly uneven where it had shifted over the years. All of it hers. All of it maintained with quiet effort that no one else seemed to notice. She thought of Ethan's house, the photographs Clara occasionally shared. Wide open spaces, polished floors, sunlight spilling through large windows. A life that looked effortless from a distance. She had never compared before. Never measured what she had against what they had built. But now the contrast stood out in a way it never had. If he had given her something significant enough to change her life, why had nothing changed? The question did not feel dramatic. It did not arrive with anger or accusation. Simply existed. Steady and persistent, asking to be answered. Margaret turned away from the window and reached for her coat. The same wool coat she had worn through the last 2 winters, still in good condition, still serviceable, though the lining had begun to thin at the cuffs. She slipped it on and picked up her keys, her mind already moving toward the next step without needing to name it. She would not confront anyone, not yet. She would not rely on explanations that could be shaped or softened. Instead, she would look, quietly, carefully, the way she always had when something did not feel quite right. As she stepped outside and locked the door behind her, Margaret Whitmore carried with her a calm that did not come from certainty, but from the simple decision to find the truth for herself, no matter how long it had been waiting to be seen. The bank was only a 10-minute drive from Margaret's house, a route she had taken countless times over the years, yet that morning it felt unfamiliar. As if each stop sign and quiet intersection carried a weight she had not noticed before. She parked in her usual spot, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment with her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, not hesitating, not afraid, simply allowing herself a final second of stillness before stepping into something she could no longer ignore. Inside, the air was cool and faintly scented with polished wood and paper. A smell she associated with order, with records kept and truths documented. Margaret approached the counter with the same composed posture she had carried her entire life, offering a small, polite smile to the young teller who greeted her. She did not mention confusion or suspicion. She did not reference anything from the night before. Instead, she asked a simple question, one that sounded routine, almost ordinary, as if she were merely reviewing her accounts after a long time away. The teller nodded and began typing, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard, the soft clicking filling the space between them. Margaret watched quietly, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, though inside, she was measuring every second, every small shift in the young woman's face. I am not seeing any additional properties under your name, Mum, the teller said after a moment, her tone professional, neutral. Just your primary residence. Margaret inclined her head slightly, as if this confirmed something expected, not something that should not exist at all. And transfers, she added gently, any regular deposits that might not be immediately obvious. The teller hesitated briefly, then navigated to another screen, the glow of the monitor reflecting faintly in her eyes. There were no consistent external transfers into your account over the past 2 years, she said, scrolling once more as if to be certain. Nothing outside of your usual activity, Margaret thanked her, her voice calm, almost warm, and stepped away from the counter without any outward sign that anything had changed, though everything had. She moved to one of the small desks near the window and sat down, placing her handbag carefully beside her chair, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the desk as she looked out at the parking lot beyond the glass. 2 years, no house, no transfers, no trace of anything Ethan had described as if it were fact. The pieces did not fit, not because they were missing, but because they had never been placed where they were meant to be. Another memory surfaced, clearer this time. Clara sitting at the dining table during a previous visit, a stack of documents spread neatly in front of her, explaining in that same polished tone that she had taken care of several financial arrangements so Ethan would not have to worry about them, that everything had been handled efficiently, professionally. Margaret had trusted that, not blindly, but naturally, because trust had always been the foundation of how she understood family. Now, that foundation felt less like something solid and more like something that had been carefully rearranged while she was not looking. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small notebook, the kind she had used for years to keep track of expenses, appointments, details that mattered. And she opened it to a blank page. Slowly, with steady handwriting, she wrote down what she knew. Not assumptions, not conclusions, just facts. No property in her name beyond her home. No incoming transfers. No record of anything that could explain Ethan's certainty. She paused, the pen hovering briefly before she added one more line. Clara handled the paperwork. The words did not accuse. They did not explain. They simply existed on the page. Waiting, Margaret closed the notebook and slipped it back into her bag, her movements as controlled as ever, her breathing even. Her thoughts now aligned in a way they had not been the night before. She stood, smoothing the front of her coat, and walked toward the exit, offering a small nod of thanks as she passed the teller again. Outside, the late morning sun had grown brighter, casting long, clear shadows across the pavement, and as Margaret stepped into the light, she did not feel overwhelmed or uncertain. She felt something quieter, sharper, a recognition that whatever had been hidden was not gone. It was simply elsewhere, and she would find it, piece by piece, without raising her voice, without asking permission, until there was nothing left that could remain concealed. Margaret did not drive home right away after leaving the bank. Instead, she turned onto a quieter road that led toward the older part of town, the section where businesses had stood for decades without changing their names or their purpose, places that still believed in paper records and long conversations rather than quick digital confirmations. She parked in front of a small brick building with a modest brass sign that read Henderson & Cole, Attorneys at Law. The same firm that had handled her husband's affairs years ago. And for a moment she remained seated, looking at the entrance as if measuring not the distance, but the weight of what stepping inside might confirm. She had not called ahead, had not scheduled an appointment, because this was not something she wanted filtered through preparation or explanation. It needed to be seen as it was, unarranged and unguarded. When she finally stepped out of the car, the air felt warmer than it had earlier, the afternoon sun settling across her shoulders as she walked toward the door with the same quiet steadiness that had carried her through every difficult moment of her life. Inside, the office was exactly as she remembered. Shelves lined with neatly organized files, the faint scent of leather and old paper lingering in the air. And behind the front desk, a receptionist who looked up with a polite smile that shifted into recognition after a brief pause. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said warmly, standing slightly as if out of respect. "It has been a while." Margaret returned the smile, small and composed, and asked if Mr. Henderson was available, her voice even, giving nothing away. A few minutes later, she was seated in a quiet office across from a man who had grown older in the same way she had, his hair thinner, his expression more measured, but his eyes still sharp, still attentive. He greeted her with genuine concern, asking how she had been, how she was managing, questions that felt sincere but also distant from the reason she had come. Margaret did not linger on pleasantries. She did not circle the subject. Instead she spoke plainly, not emotionally, not urgently, just clearly, explaining that her son believed he had transferred a property into her name 2 years prior, and that she had no record of it. Mr. Henderson listened without interruption, his fingers lightly pressed together as if holding the information in place while he considered it. He turned to his computer, then to a set of physical files, pulling one from a drawer with a familiarity that suggested long habit rather than recent use. The room grew quieter as he reviewed the documents, the soft rustle of paper the only sound between them. Margaret watched him, not searching for answers in his expression, but noting the moment his posture shifted, subtle but unmistakable, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the pause that lasted just a fraction longer than necessary. "There was a property transaction," he said finally, his tone careful, measured in a way that carried more weight than urgency ever could. "A lake house, as you mentioned." Margaret did not move, did not lean forward or ask for clarification. She simply waited. "It was processed through an intermediary authorization," he continued, selecting a document and turning it slightly so she could see. "The paperwork was submitted on your behalf, but the ownership was ultimately assigned elsewhere." The words were precise, neutral, but they settled into the room with a clarity that left no space for misunderstanding. Margaret's gaze lowered to the document, her eyes tracing the lines without needing to read every word, because the structure itself told the story. The signatures, the dates, the routing of authority, and there, near the bottom, a name she recognized immediately. Not her own, not Ethan's, but Clara's. Margaret did not react outwardly. She did not question the legality or raise her voice. She simply absorbed the information as it presented itself, piece by piece, until it formed something complete. "Was this done with my consent?" she asked, her voice as calm as it had been when she entered. Mr. Henderson hesitated, not because he did not know the answer, but because he understood the weight of giving it. "The documents indicate authorization," he said carefully, "but the circumstances surrounding that authorization are unclear." Margaret nodded once, a small, controlled movement that acknowledged the truth without needing it explained further. She closed her eyes briefly, not in distress, but in recognition, as if a pattern she had only sensed before had now revealed its full shape. When she opened them again, there was no confusion left, only a quiet, steady awareness that what had been taken had not been accidental, and that every detail, every omission, had been part of something far more deliberate than she had allowed herself to consider before. Margaret did not ask for copies of the documents immediately. She did not reach for them or examine them again. Instead, she let them rest on the desk between her and Mr. Henderson, as if their presence alone was enough, as if touching them too soon might rush something that required patience. She thanked him quietly, her voice composed, and asked only for confirmation of dates, of names, of the sequence in which everything had been processed, each question simple, precise, and answered without hesitation. The pattern became clearer with each response, not louder, not more dramatic, just more complete, like lines drawn carefully until an image finally revealed itself. When she stood to leave, she carried no visible sign of distress, no urgency in her movements, only a calm that had settled deeper than before, the kind that does not come from comfort but from understanding. Outside, the afternoon had begun to soften, the sunlight no longer sharp but diffused, stretching across the quiet street in long, even lines. Margaret walked back to her car and sat for a moment, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze unfocused, not because she was lost, but because she was thinking in a way she had not allowed herself to in years. Clara's name remained at the center of everything, not as a suspicion now, but as a fact, supported by signatures, by dates, by decisions made in rooms Margaret had never been invited into. She thought of the many times Clara had stepped in with that same composed efficiency, offering to simplify things, to take responsibility, to ensure that everything was handled properly, and how easily Margaret had accepted it, not out of weakness, but out of trust, trust that had not been broken in a single moment, but adjusted slowly, redirected, until it no longer belonged where it once had. She reached into her handbag again and took out her notebook, turning to the page she had written earlier, and beneath the line that named Clara, she added another, property reassigned, authorization unclear, each word chosen carefully, not to accuse, but to record. Margaret closed the notebook and placed it back inside her bag, then started the engine and drove home without turning on the radio, without filling the silence with anything unnecessary. When she arrived, the house greeted her in the same quiet way it always had, unchanged, steady, waiting. She stepped inside, removed her coat, and placed her keys in the small dish by the door, her movements deliberate, almost ritualistic, as if maintaining order in the present would allow her to manage what had already been disrupted in the past. She walked into the living room and sat in her usual chair, the one position near the window where she could see the front yard, and for a long moment, she did nothing at all. She did not cry, did not replay conversations, did not question why, because the answers to those questions had already begun to reveal themselves in ways that no explanation could soften. Instead, she allowed herself to observe, not the people who had acted, but her own role in the space they had created around her, the silence she had accepted, the responsibility she had allowed others to assume, the distance she had explained away as something natural. None of it had been sudden. None of it had demanded attention at the time, and that was precisely how it had been allowed to continue. Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair, her hands resting gently against the armrests, and looked out at the quiet street beyond the window, where nothing appeared out of place, where everything continued as it always had. But inside, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, not because of what had been taken, but because of what had now been seen clearly. She understood, with a certainty that required no further confirmation, that this was not something that could be addressed with a single conversation or resolved with a simple correction. It was something that had been built carefully over time, and it would need to be dismantled in the same way, step by step, without haste, without noise, until there was nothing left to hide behind. And as the light outside began to fade into the early evening, Margaret Whitmore remained seated in that quiet room, no longer uncertain, no longer questioning whether something was wrong, but preparing, in her own measured and deliberate way, for what would come next. The next morning arrived without urgency, the kind of quiet, ordinary morning that would have passed unnoticed before, but now every small detail seemed to carry weight, as if even the stillness was part of something unfolding. Margaret moved through her routine as she always had, preparing breakfast, folding the newspaper without reading it, setting her cup of coffee on the same spot at the kitchen table. But her mind was no longer resting in the present moment. It was moving ahead, carefully, deliberately, considering not what had already happened, but what needed to be done next. She did not think in terms of confrontation. She did not imagine raised voices or explanations, because none of that would change what had already been set in motion long before she became aware of it. Instead, she thought about structure, about process, about the quiet systems that governed ownership, authority, and accountability, the same systems Clara had relied on, the same systems that could now be used to reveal what had been concealed. After finishing her coffee, Margaret returned to the small desk in the corner of her living room and opened her notebook again. Turning to a fresh page, she began writing slowly, listing what she needed. Not questions, but actions. Obtain full transaction records, verify authorization documents, confirm timeline of transfers, each line clear, practical, free of emotion. She paused briefly, then added one more. Request independent review. The words felt solid, grounded, not reactive, but intentional. Margaret closed the notebook and set it aside, then reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found a name she had not called in years. Daniel Pierce, a former colleague of her late husband, someone who had built his reputation on careful financial oversight and a strict adherence to detail. She hesitated for only a moment before pressing the call button, not because she was unsure, but because she understood that once this step was taken, there would be no returning to quiet acceptance. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered, older now, but steady, and Margaret introduced herself with the same calm clarity she had used in every conversation since the truth began to surface. She did not share everything. Not yet. She simply explained that she needed guidance reviewing a series of transactions that did not align with what she had been told. Her tone measured, her words precise. Daniel listened, asking only a few questions, each one direct, focused on facts rather than assumptions, and by the time the call ended, Margaret had an appointment set for later that week. She placed the phone down gently and sat back in her chair, her hands resting lightly against her lap, her breathing even, her posture unchanged. Outside, the day had begun to brighten, sunlight stretching across the yard in quiet lines, illuminating the small imperfections she had long stopped noticing. Inside, Margaret Whitmore felt no rush, no need to accelerate what was already moving forward. She understood now that this was not about proving something quickly. It was about building something undeniable, piece by piece, document by document, until there was no space left for denial or explanation. She stood and walked toward the window, her reflection faintly visible in the glass, older than she remembered, perhaps, but not diminished, not weakened, simply clearer. For years, she had accepted what was presented to her, trusting that what she was told reflected what was true. But that time had passed, and in its place was something steadier, something far more deliberate. Margaret did not need to raise her voice. She did not need to demand anything. because she already understood the most important part. The truth did not need to be forced. It only needed to be revealed. And she would see to it, quietly, thoroughly, and without hesitation. The appointment with Daniel Pierce took place 3 days later in a quiet office overlooking a narrow street lined with aging oak trees, their branches casting slow-moving shadows across the pavement as if time itself had softened in that space. Margaret arrived 10 minutes early, not out of nervousness, but out of habit, carrying with her a neatly organized folder that contained every document she had gathered, every note she had written, each piece arranged with the same care she had applied to every responsibility in her life. Daniel greeted her with a firm handshake and a measured nod, his manner professional but not distant, and as they sat across from each other, he opened the folder without commentary, allowing the silence to hold while he reviewed the contents. Margaret watched him the way she had learned to watch everything recently, not searching for reassurance, but for accuracy, for the subtle indicators that something aligned or did not. The room remained quiet except for the occasional turning of a page, the soft tap of a pen against the desk, and the steady rhythm of Daniel's breathing as he moved through the material. After several minutes, he leaned back slightly, his expression unchanged but his focus sharpened, as if the information had settled into place. "You were correct to question this," he said finally, his tone calm, not dramatic, but certain. Margaret did not respond immediately. She simply inclined her head, acknowledging what she had already begun to understand. Daniel continued, explaining that the transaction had been structured in a way that diverted both ownership and associated funds, not through a single action, but through a sequence of decisions that required access, authorization, and intent. Each word he chose was deliberate, free of speculation, grounded in what could be proven. Margaret listened without interruption, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the desk, her posture steady, her expression composed. The authorization appears to have been executed under a general power of representation, he added, sliding one of the documents slightly closer to her, which would have allowed someone to act on your behalf if it had been properly granted. Margaret's eyes moved briefly to the page, then back to Daniel, and she asked the only question that mattered. Was it properly granted? Daniel paused, not because the answer was uncertain, but because it required precision. There is no clear record that you personally initiated or confirmed that authorization in a way that meets standard verification, he said, his voice even, which raises significant concerns about how it was obtained and applied. The words did not shock Margaret. They settled into her understanding like the final piece of something that had been forming quietly beneath the surface. She did not feel anger, not in the way people often expect. What she felt was clarity, sharp and unmistakable, a recognition that what had been done was not a misunderstanding, not a mistake, but a deliberate use of systems she had trusted. Daniel outlined the next steps in practical terms, requesting certified copies, initiating a formal review, ensuring that all actions taken could be traced and evaluated without interference. Margaret listened carefully, not because she needed reassurance, but because she intended to follow each step exactly as it was presented. When the meeting concluded, she gathered her folder with the same measured movements she had used when she arrived, standing without hesitation, without urgency. Outside, the afternoon light had begun to fade again, the shadows longer now, more defined, and as Margaret walked toward her car, she did not feel burdened by what she had learned. She felt prepared. For the first time since that quiet question at the dinner table, everything made sense. Not emotionally, but structurally. Every detail aligned with a pattern that could now be seen clearly from beginning to end. And as she started the engine and drove away, Margaret Whitmore carried with her not uncertainty, not confusion, but something far more powerful. The certainty that the truth was no longer hidden, only waiting to be presented at the right moment, in the right way, where it could no longer be ignored. The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday evening, Not by Margaret, but by Clara, who had suggested it with the same composed confidence she had always carried, framing it as a necessary discussion about the future, about practical arrangements, about what would be best moving forward. Margaret agreed without hesitation, her voice calm on the phone, offering no resistance, no questions, only a simple confirmation that she would be there. The house was brighter than usual when she arrived, lights on in every room, the polished surfaces reflecting a sense of order that felt intentional, almost staged. And as she stepped inside, she noticed how everything had been arranged to suggest control, stability, authority. Ethan greeted her first, his expression warm but distracted, as if his attention was already divided between what he wanted to say and what he was expected to support. Clara stood near the dining table, a set of documents neatly aligned in front of her, her posture straight, her smile measured, the same expression Margaret had once interpreted as reassurance. They sat together, the three of them, in a space that had once felt familiar but now carried a different weight, one defined not by comfort, but by expectation. Clara began speaking almost immediately, her tone calm, professional, outlining a plan that had clearly been prepared in advance, explaining that maintaining Margaret's current home was becoming inefficient, that transitioning her into a smaller, more manageable living arrangement would provide convenience, security, and access to services that would better suit her needs. Each word was carefully chosen, each sentence structured to sound reasonable, considerate, even thoughtful. Ethan nodded occasionally, adding small comments that echoed Clara's points, reinforcing them without fully leading them. Margaret listened without interruption, her hands resting quietly in her lap, her gaze steady, not challenging, not questioning, simply present. When Clara finished, she slid a document forward across the table, her fingers releasing it with a slight pause, as if the moment itself required acknowledgement. "We have already prepared the necessary paperwork," she said, her voice softening just slightly. "This will make everything easier for you." Margaret looked at the document but did not reach for it immediately. She allowed a brief silence to settle, long enough to shift the rhythm of the room, long enough for the certainty in Clara's posture to begin to waver, if only slightly. Then, with the same calm precision she had shown in every step leading to this moment, Margaret opened her handbag and placed her own folder on the table, aligning it carefully in front of her. She did not speak right away. She did not match Clara's tone or her pace. Instead, she opened the folder slowly, revealing the documents inside one by one, each page positioned deliberately, each detail visible without explanation. Ethan's expression changed first, the easy confidence fading into something less certain as his eyes moved across the unfamiliar papers, his attention shifting from Clara to Margaret without a word. Clara remained still, her posture controlled, but the tension in her hands became visible in the way her fingers pressed lightly against the edge of the table. Margaret finally spoke, her voice even, measured. "Getting no acquiescen. Only clarity. I reviewed the transaction records," she said, her eyes resting briefly on Clara before returning to the documents, "and I confirmed the authorization pathway used to transfer the property." The room grew quieter, the earlier confidence replaced by something more fragile, something that could not be held in place by carefully prepared words. Margaret continued, not raising her voice, not changing her tone, simply presenting what she had gathered, the dates, the signatures, the discrepancies, each detail placed into the space between them with quiet precision. Clara did not interrupt, did not redirect the conversation as she had before, because there was no space left to do so. And as the final document was set on the table, the structure Clara had built so carefully began to shift, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with the unmistakable weight of truth placed exactly where it could no longer be moved. The silence that followed did not break immediately, settled first, heavy and unmistakable, filling the space where Clara's certainty had been only moments before. Ethan looked down at the documents again, then back at Margaret. his expression no longer distracted but searching, as if he were trying to reconcile two versions of reality that could not exist at the same time. "Mom," he said finally, his voice quieter than before, stripped of its earlier confidence. "What is all this?" Margaret did not answer him directly, not because she wished to avoid the question, but because the answer was already in front of him, laid out in ink and paper, requiring no interpretation beyond what it clearly showed. Instead, she closed the folder slowly, aligning the edges with the same careful precision she had used throughout the evening, and rested her hands lightly on top of it. Clara remained seated, her posture still composed, but the stillness now felt different, no longer controlled, but held in place by effort. "There must be some misunderstanding," Clara said at last, her voice steady, though the softness it carried no longer sounded reassuring. "These processes can be complicated. Things can appear different on paper than they are in reality." Margaret turned her head slightly toward her, her gaze calm, unhurried, and for the first time, there was no trace of uncertainty in it. "No," she said simply, her voice quiet but firm. "They appear exactly as they were done." The words did not rise, did not sharpen. They remained even, and that made them harder to dismiss. Ethan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that revealed more than his words had. The first visible sign that he understood something had been kept from him, something that could not be explained away by convenience or oversight. He looked at Clara, waiting, not for reassurance this time, but for clarity. Clara did not meet his eyes immediately, and in that small hesitation, the structure she had built began to give way. Not dramatically, not with a sudden collapse, but with a gradual loss of balance that could no longer support itself. Margaret did not press further. She did not ask questions or demand explanations, because she no longer needed them. Everything that mattered had already been placed on the table, visible, documented, complete. She stood then, slowly, without urgency, gathering her folder and placing it back into her handbag, her movements measured, unshaken. Ethan rose as well, instinctively, as if to stop her or to ask something more. But the words did not come, not because he did not have them, but because he did not yet know which ones would matter. Margaret looked at him briefly, her expression neither cold nor forgiving, simply clear. And in that look was something he had not seen before. Not distance, but finality. She turned toward the door, her steps quiet against the polished floor. And as she reached for the handle, Clara spoke again, her voice lower now, stripped of its earlier certainty. "Margaret, we can discuss this. We can find a solution." Margaret paused, but she did not turn back. She did not reconsider. Because what had been done was not a problem to be negotiated. It was a truth that had already defined itself. "You already did," she said, her voice steady. "Caring no anger." Only conclusion. She opened the door and stepped outside, the evening air cooler now, the light fading into a calm, even gray that softened the edges of everything it touched. Behind her, the house remained lit, the conversation unfinished, the realization still unfolding. But Margaret Whitmore did not look back. She walked to her car with the same quiet composure she had carried through every step of this journey, not as someone who had won, but as someone who had seen clearly and chosen, at last, to step out of what no longer belonged to her.